Good afternoon. Okay, we're going to take a survey. Who in here gets really excited about this topic? Me. Okay. All right. Who in here is deathly afraid of this topic? Who's neutral? Okay.
I'm slightly more
That's all.
positive and neutral, but I'm
Okay. So you're on the spectrum of kind of excited. Okay, that's great. So we're going to cover all gamuts. I have no disclosures to make. There are some disclaimers. Okay. You may get uncomfortable. It's okay. I will get nerdy. I will say big words. Stop me, ask questions. I don't care. I'm not a doctor. Call me Amber. There are a lot of scientific unknowns, and I've noted those with a question mark. Okay, but that's where it's really exciting because our Christian worldview comes into play, and we have answers for our kids and our culture that maybe other people do not. The information I'm presenting is from my knowledge, not necessarily experience. My kids are still pretty young. Okay, so a lot of you have already been through this with your own kids. So please share. Give us some examples. Give us some advice. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anything. It's scientific and philosophical, and I've been praying that I can glorify God in the way that I present it. But again, correct me if you feel I'm out of line. Our agenda for today is, of course, to discuss puberty. So we're going to define a lot of terms. We have to define our terms. We're going to talk about the events that occur during puberty, the anatomy and appropriate terminology, the physiology and endocrinology, the external changes that you'll see, the timing, the physics or the behavior changes, God's good design for sexuality, the talk. I put that in air quotes. We'll get to that. Takeaways, and then we'll have a time for discussion and questions. If you have a question you don't want to ask out loud, just write it down. We'll collect it. But you are free to raise your hand too. I don't care. So puberty defined, it is the physical, cognitive, and psychosocial changes that occur during adolescence that cause a maturation in stature, body composition, sex characteristics, fertility, and organ systems. So this is an all-body process that occurs. Some terms that I will use. I wanted to go ahead and define those. So thelarchy is the appearance of breast tissue. Menarche, of course, is the first episode of menstrual bleeding. It is not always related to ovulation. Spermarchy is first sperm production. And pubarchy is the appearance of pubic and axillary hair. Most of these are self-explanatory, I know, but I wanted to define those. Pubarchy can also include body odor too. So this is the normal anatomy. This is where people will start to get squirmy, and that's okay. But it's very important that we use appropriate terminology when we're discussing things with our kids, and we'll get to why that is so important. So we want to refer to things by their anatomical term. So get used to saying it if you haven't already, or if you're in the early stages of this. So I'm going to notate some of the ones that I definitely would want you to use. Penis, of course. Urethra is where the pee comes out. The testes is the internal organ. The scrotum, it surrounds that. We have the vulva. That's just the external structure of the female. The clitoris, of course, the urethra, where the pee comes out, again, the labia, and then the vagina is the internal structure. We kind of can use those inappropriately, and so I just want to make sure that I make a note of that. And then, of course, the anus is the external part of the bottom. So what is going on here? What really happens? There's two things that are happening in the body. Gonadarchy is what we would typically think of as puberty, okay? And that's the increase in the activity of something called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So this is a connection system between the brain and the gonads. This is a picture. You probably can't see it very well, but essentially some things happen in the brain to then stimulate the gonads, to then stimulate the production of different hormones in the body, like estradiol, testosterone, DHEAS. You don't have to know all the ins and outs. I just wanted you to understand that there's a connection going on between the brain and the body. So this is where everything is connected. The other thing going on that people don't really think about is something called adrenarche. The adrenal glands sit right above the kidneys and produce a lot of different hormones. Epinephrine is one of them that you will know about, but it also produces DHES in the adrenal cortex. So there's a little bit of a negative feedback loop going on between the brain, the adrenal glands, and the gonads as well. And these two things, though they are independent and happen totally independent of one another, they are interconnected in that they talk to each other. So I just wanted to point that out because we typically only think things are going on right here, right? But we forget that the adrenal glands also play a role. Gonadarchy, well, that sounds like a strange word, but here's a closer picture of what's going on. So this is a male, this is a female. Up here in the hypothalamus in the brainstem, we are stimulating the gonads. Here's, the testicles. Down here we have the ovaries and then the follicles coming out of the ovaries. Here we have the Leydig cells. And look at all the hormones. Do you see how complicated this system is? This is why our kids get complicated at this age, okay? That's just what I wanted you to see the picture of, that there are a lot of hormones. Males and females both have estrogen and testosterone, okay? They both make both of those things. So we often think men are making only testosterone, women are making only estrogen. They're both making both. And so that's why, again, we have lots of hormonal fluctuations going on because those systems are very similar, actually, just different levels. So how does this all start? We really don't know. We don't know why it starts when it does. There are some hypotheses like androgen stimulation, that would be coming from the adrenal glands, some GnRH, that's gonadotropin releasing hormone that comes out of the hypothalamus. There's all different kinds of genetics we think play a role, and medicine really is going toward a lot of genetic research right now because we're starting to figure some of these things out. So there are genetic factors for sure. We can tell that based on the age that kids start menarche or pubarche compared to their parents or grandparents, for instance. We just don't know what exactly is triggering that. It could be body weight. So we know there's a correlation between higher body weight, earlier onset of puberty. We just don't know why. Maybe it's leptin. That's a hormone that's produced inside of our stomach and our intestines. It could be height. So maybe if you have a higher genetic predisposition for being tall, you might actually start puberty sooner as well. And then there's some things that could inhibit the production of some of these hormones, some genetic factors again, some neurotransmitters, and so there's just a lot of things we really don't know. We don't have an answer for it. The takeaway, an integrated model for the onset remains elusive. 50 to 75% of the variation in normal timing is related to genetics. We know that because we can study and see the results, but only 7.4% of the variants have been discovered. So this is pretty crazy with all of the research that we have. So what will you see? We're going to have secondary sex characteristics. We will get into these a little bit more. It's called the Tanner stages. We have breast and genital changes, pubic hair growth. This is a series of events that has a predictable pattern. It should have a predictable pattern. If it doesn't, that's where we kind of, our ears perk up and we kind of think maybe something is going on. It typically always starts with a growth spurt, and I'm going to show you some charts that prove that's usually the first sign. So for females, that's a couple years earlier than it is for males, but that's usually the start of everything. So first the trunk will grow, then the limbs will grow, and about 20% of the adult height is accrued during this time period, and this lasts about 2 years. You'll also have bone mineralization and growth. You'll have a lengthening of the bones, a widening of the bones, and then the content and density increases as well. This does increase their risk for fractures. I put a question mark because there's some different results dependent on the study, but it is pretty common to see that. Earlier onset of this particular part of puberty does increase the risk of osteoporosis later in adult life because you're having a longer time span of the bones being able to lose their density. Weight and body composition, there's also an increase in lean body mass, as you probably already knew, and that's in early puberty. Then later puberty, they're going to put on more fat, right? And both are important. Those are both important in that process. We know that excessive weight gain during puberty does increase the risk of obesity into adulthood as well, and we're going to talk just a little bit more about that. Adrenarche, again, that's even more confusing because we don't hear that term. And this is just a fancy graph showing all of the hormones involved in that. We have aldosterone, cortisol, and DHEAS. The timing they have figured out, if you study this, is inversely related to birth weight. So if you have a low birth weight baby, the timing is usually later. So it's inversely related, I can't say that word today, with when this all starts. And again, remember, this is starting separate from the other part, but they talk to each other. This is positively related to body growth, obesity, and prolactin levels. Clinical manifestations develop shortly after this starts, sometimes right before, the start of gonadarche, that other part of the system that we talked about. This is what's responsible for sweat glands and body odor. Yay. Okay, and this is most likely the main driving factor for sexual urges and thoughts. We don't think about that. Again, that's why I wanted to point it out, because this is the system responsible for that. And remember, this is starting earlier than the other part. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what we see in females. Of course, they're going to grow first. We talked about that. Then the ovaries enlarged. Then sometimes thelarche, that's the appearance of breast tissue, if you remember from the terminology. Sometimes pubarche instead, like axillary hair and pubic hair. Then they get discharged, and then they'll start their period about 2.6 years from the onset of this. So it does take about 2.5 years from when you first see things happening. There are some gender-specific concerns during puberty. Iron deficiency and anemia, of course, because they're losing blood. And then gynecologic concerns related to abnormal periods. So young girls will think it's abnormal, it's not happening every month, it's happening all over. That's very normal. It takes 7 to 8 years for all of the cycles to kind of talk and get a regulated cycle. So that's very normal. We'll talk a little bit more about menarche, the onset of menses. Like I said before, this is not related to ovulation during the first bleed, okay, or even the second or third. This can actually be driven just by those adrenal hormones for the first 2 to 3 years, and so it doesn't mean they're ovulating when they start bleeding. But this just shows the nice little path of how this is the uterus, gaining some momentum, and then it's going to have to slough off. I just wanted you to see that because it's interesting. And again, lots of factors going on. So this is ovulation up here. These are some other hormones which you can't see, but if anyone really is interested in this, I'm happy to send you the presentation or the pictures. Cycles will vary for several years, like we talked about, due to inconsistent ovulation, because the progesterone to stabilize all of this is just not mature enough yet. It's not being, spit out, for lack of a better term, at the right time, in the right amount, and it takes a while for that to happen. The duration of time needed to reach, regular ovulatory cycles is dependent on when they start their first bleed, and so that's kind of listed in that chart. The mean cycle length for young girls is 34.5 days, so about a month and a half or a month and a week. So again, very normal, but the range is really big, 21 to 45 days. Typically bleeding is 4.9 to 5.4 days and 30 mLs of blood, right? That's a little, if you think about a little, cup or something. That's about, a cup. So that's quite a lot. So for males, height velocity, of course, is first as well. then an increase in testicular volume, and then penile growth and pubic hair. Some gender-specific concerns here are gynecomastia. That's where they get a little bit of breast bud development, because remember, we talked about they have estrogen just like the females do, and it's going to spike up because when their testosterone spikes, it gets converted to DHES and then down to estradiol and estrogen. And so you will see this happening. It's very, very normal. If it's marked or persistent, like it's lasting through all of puberty, you kind of start to think about, could they have an adrenal insufficiency or something else going on where they're making too much testosterone? And so that's just something to think about, to get looked at, but otherwise it's very normal. Some health concerns for both. Acne. I really wanted to point this out because people forget that acne can be psychologically and emotionally very devastating for kids, and it really does need to be treated early because it will scar very quickly, and that is very hard to treat. And so I do remind parents a lot, if your kids have acne, there are over-the-counter treatments. We can treat it really easily, but it can cause a lot of distress. I know that might sound a little bit, I don't know, vain or something to a lot of people, but this can become very distressing because it's painful, and again, it's hard to treat. If it's happening and it's very severe, or let's say it's really before puberty is starting, we do start to think about endocrine disorders because it's driven by a lot of these hormones we're talking about. They can get musculoskeletal injuries. We talked about that because their growth is just so sporadic. And then it happens really quickly, and so they'll lose range of motion. This is that classic, tall kid on the basketball team that's just gangly, and they have an increased risk of falling and injuring themselves because the coordination is not there. Then they also get an increase in muscle mass and fat deposition, and it's all happening at one time. And so this is when we start to see fractures and other things. You all have probably heard of Osgood-Schlatter. That's where they get a little bump here on the tibial tuberosity of the lower bone of the leg, and that can be really irritating. It can be painful when they're jumping and moving around. They will outgrow it at some point, but it does worry some people, so it's just something to point out if they have it. Myopia. So people forget the eyes grow with us and they change, and so this can start to happen during puberty, believe it or not. They can start to have changes in their vision, so take that seriously. If they're telling you, I can't see the board anymore, I can't see out the car window, that's probably true. It's probably happening. Scoliosis is really common at this age because the spine, again, has to grow with them. And most of the time they'll outgrow it, but it's something to pay attention to and just make sure they're not having pain with it. These are the Tanner stages. So this is something, for instance, I would use in my office if I'm doing a physical exam on a kid going through puberty to note where are they at. Tanner stage 1, 2, 3, 4. You can look this up on Google because I know you probably can't read it very well. But it's broken down into stages, stage 1 being pre-puberty, all the way to stage 5, which is, the most mature age. And that's based on males and females. So this is showing the females, this is showing the males, what you would expect to see and find. But you can use that as parents as well to gauge whether you think your kid, is a year in, 2 years in, how much longer do they have before I'm going to start seeing the next change. And it kind of can help you guide them through that. When will this happen? That's a good question. Okay, this is debatable, and the research is kind of all over the place, but we have seen a clear decrease in age of onset. The media does blow this a little bit out of proportion, okay? Because when you actually do the research, there was kind of a quick taper from the 1800s to the 1900s where we really saw the age go down quickly. But now, since the mid-1900s, only about a 4-month difference from the age of onset. So when you're hearing this in the media, oh, it just starts so much earlier, 2 years, 3 years, that's simply not true for females. It could be for males. There's some research that proves maybe 1.5 to 2 years earlier, a little more drastic. So that's possible. we're seeing more of an effect on thelarchy. So that's the onset of breast tissue development, if you remember, as opposed to menarche, which is the onset of bleeding. So that's only by about 4 months. So yes, a 1-year difference in maybe seeing some changes, but not huge. And these are specifically the stats for the US because this does vary by country. But the mean age of thelarchy for girls is 9.3 years. And the mean age of menarche is 12.2. So you can see there's a gap of about, 2.5 years in there, give or take a little more, actually almost 3, between when you'll see breast tissue development and when you'll see the first onset of bleeding. So should I be concerned? So I just wanted to point out just a couple of things that should maybe be red flags to us as parents. It would be to me as a medical provider. So something called precocious puberty is where puberty, the signs start 2 or more standard deviations below the mean age of onset. So, and there will be a chart that tells you kind of the mean ages. This is typically defined as breast development before age 8, or testicular development before age 9, and then the thelarchy is given by age 2. And they do does make a difference between white and black children because there's a difference in when things start. Delayed puberty is when puberty does not start 2 or more years after the mean age of onset. So this is typically lack of breast development by age 12 to 13, or testicular enlargement by 13 to 14. And they do change the definitions based on what the stats are, but this is the most current stat that we use. This is showing, so I believe, yes, okay, this is females, this is males. So if you can see, I know it's hard to see, but so this is age 12 right here. So this is when we're gonna see the height change in girls, about 10 to 11 is when that happens. But for males, we won't see that until 13 to 14. You all know this, you've seen this because the girls always grow first and the boys start to get really worried. Oh my gosh, the girls are taller than me. Give it a couple of years and they're going to catch up and probably a little more so. But I just like that chart because it reminds us that's normal. So this is where we get into the physics, what has happened to our sweet children. We talked about there's a lot of hormones going on. But the timing of all of this can have an influence on their self-esteem and behavior, right? If they're starting way earlier than the rest of their peers, it might be embarrassing. If they're starting way later, it might be embarrassing. So it does have an effect on them. Plus, they have all of the hormone interaction going on. They could start to have obesity. They could have acne, like we talked about. There could be a mismatch between the timing of development and their chronological age. Like I said, their other peers are changing at different times. This is when the risk of depression goes up. Here, I kind of pointed this out where there's an increased risk of depression for females, but it could be the opposite for males because boys start to like the way they look during puberty and smell. They even like that they have a little bit of a smell. They truly do. Girls, on the other hand, do not. They're bothered by it. So the studies really show that it's quite opposite. This is where disruptive behaviors could worsen because they're growing. And so they're trying to figure out, how do I keep this under control and how do I cope with it again, all over again. And then they have sexual thoughts, and that can be bothersome to them if they don't know how to talk about that. Decision making kind of is hard because, again, the hormones are telling them things, they feel things, and they aren't sure how to act on those. We call this hot cognition versus cold cognition, and they can bounce around, as you know. This is all controlled by the prefrontal cortex, right? This is our fight or flight. This part of the brain gets highly stimulated by all of these hormones. This is, again, why they start to act a little bit out of control because their body is in fight or flight, can be. And this matures later than the rest of the brain. So for females, this part of the brain is not fully developed until about age 31. For males, it's more like 33. That's crazy to think about. So you really have to teach them how to cope through those emotions. They start to take risk-taking behaviors because, again, those hormones are what drives it. And this could be somewhat due to peer associations and, again, some of these kind of emotions that come with their age and when things are happening. Some notes about timing and morbidity. I just wanted to make a note of this because people think, well, is it okay if they're starting this earlier? Is it okay if they're starting it later? We do know that an earlier age of onset increases the risk of breast cancer, and that's probably because they're getting exposed to estrogen earlier on. So more years of exposure means higher risk. Type 2 diabetes and glucose intolerance is part of this because estrogen does play a role in that. Early puberty increases the risk of all reproductive cancers, arthritis, depression, hypertension, and lower educational attainment. And we know this. I mean, this has been studied ad nauseum, and it really is true. Delayed puberty actually lowers bone mineral density, so it can increase their fracture risk, cause depression and anxiety. And then early or late puberty increases the risk of coronary artery disease and cardiovascular disease, so either one. So really it's best if they're staying more in that average range. You're going to have a better, a lower risk for most adulthood morbidities. Now the difficult part, the birds and the bees, right? That's what you all came to hear about, I am sure. Okay, so why is culture confused? This is where our Christian worldview gets to take a step in, right? Because we can talk about the science all day long, and it's great and wonderful, and I think our kids really need to hear it, but they also need the Christian worldview to step into this. And so that's what we're going to drift into. So sex versus gender, we're hearing this all the time. People saying, well, your sex is different than your gender. Culture defines sex as being different than gender, sex being the biological difference between males and females, gender being the individual's role in society or concept of themselves. God does not differentiate. We probably know this, but I just wanted to point it out. And then we have this debate of body versus mind, right? My mind's telling me my body is something that it's not. Again, this is not something that God would disconnect. He would have it be interconnected and interdependent. Just like we talked about. We talked about the brain and the hormones and all of the genitals and things going on. Of course, we know why culture is confused. That's sin, the flesh, and Satan. What is God's good design? Again, this could feel like you're just, oh, I've heard this, okay? But I just wanted to make sure we talked about it. Gender was created on purpose, with purpose, for a purpose. We have roles, right? Equal in dignity and worth as male and female, different in design and calling. We have sexuality, God's anthropologic design and pattern for procreation and the experience of erotic desire. God could have made it so that we procreated by touching fingers, but He did not. We all know this, right? There's biology going on, and it was with purpose. I like to think of this, if I'm talking to Christian parents, you're talking to your kids about different theological things out of the Bible and the gospel as they mature, right? There's different ways that you wouldn't just completely tell them the whole story of how, like my daughter this morning was asking, what does atonement mean? She kept hearing that in her Bible reading. Well, you wouldn't tell a 5-year-old what necessarily all of the ins and outs of atonement. It's the same here. So we're going to tell it as they mature. We're going to talk about it in steps, right? And that could be different for every child at different ages. So I like to talk about it first as God created humanity, right? So we could talk about how the Psalm 139 verse about how He formed you in the womb. And that would be a great starting place for little ones. 4, 5, 6, obviously we're talking to our kids about this really early because they can understand that. This is where you could start talking about why all human life is valuable, right? You wouldn't start talking necessarily about abortion at age 5. They're not going to understand that. They need to understand first what is normal. How did God create me? Then we could talk about God created humanity in his image, right? To bear his image. So Genesis 1, 26 and 27, God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. This is where you could start talking about how sin came into the world. Maybe this is, first, second, and third grade. You kind of start talking about that. And you could start talking to them about cultural questions about this, how we devalue human life, and maybe we don't look at people as having inherent dignity and worth. And I think that's a great next discussion. Then we can talk about God created humanity male and female. This is where you start talking about their biology, right? That our bodies change, and God made us specifically with a gender. And these verses go along with that. And then Jesus even said it himself. Have you not read? He created them from the beginning, made them male and female. This is where you could start talking about marriage. What is marriage? What does that mean? How does God define marriage? Those distinct roles and duties, mutual submission to God. And then you could bring in the differing cultural discussions about this. And this would be, 4th, 5th, maybe 6th grade. Again, based on how you as a parent are leading that. And then we could go even more. God created male and female for one another. So there's a purpose. There's a reason why there's a male and a female, right? And this is in the later years as you feel it's appropriate. And we talk about how God joins them together as one and makes them for procreation. And this is where you could talk about sexual immorality and why is it a sin before God. And I just think about it as a stepwise fashion. I think one of the most overwhelming things as a Christian is you don't feel equipped because it's these fears. No one's ever taught me appropriately, and it's something we're going to deal with the rest of our lives. And am I going to give them too much information or not enough information? And I think that all together makes it overwhelming, and it's a private subject. It's not something you can dump on them all at once or give them, but it's out there. It's out in culture all the time. They're being hit with it. So it is a really delicate balance. So we're going to talk more about that. What should I not say and do? So this is actually studied. There are actual sexual psychologists out there that will teach parents how to do this. I put some Christian resources for you that I think are really good, and I have tried to look into them in depth to know that they are appropriate and good for you to use, because there are reasons why we would not want to say some things or do some things at inappropriate times or in an inappropriate way. There are reasons for that. You have to use appropriate terms. We went over the terminology for a reason. I said get used to saying it because it is so important. There are a couple of reasons why this is important. This is the number one factor associated with sexual abuse, is using slang terms. Because if something should happen, they need to have the appropriate terminology to tell you and not feel uncomfortable saying it in front of you, right? If there's slang terms and they're expressing something to us that has happened, we may not know how to take that and we may get a big reaction. Whereas if they're using anatomical terms, it helps us to stop, understand what they're saying, and know how to react appropriately. And so this becomes really, really important in those situations. So that was the number one thing that I wanted to point out. And I know this is true in medicine, because if kids come in and they don't know what the terms mean, or they don't know what different body parts are called, they don't know how to tell you, and they're much more ashamed to tell you. And so just make sure you're teaching your kids. I mean, literally, my little 2-year-old, almost 2-year-old, she knows vulva. She literally uses the word vulva I don't just say bottom. I don't just say butt cheeks. We say those words at home. Try not to be funny. It's, don't make jokes about it. We talked a little bit about that. Not that you can't have some lighthearted conversation, but try not to be funny. I list some other things. So don't give too much detail or too little detail. do it at an age-appropriate term, like we talked about, in that stepwise fashion as they're ready for it. And you as the parent, you're the most equipped to know your child. So I would never, there's no formula, I would never be able to tell you specifically for your child what's appropriate or inappropriate. Don't talk about sex being dirty or a no-no, because it's beautiful and it's a good thing. God created it, and so we have to approach it like that. But again, at the right age. Don't start too young or too late. We talked about, don't act irritated or annoyed. If they come to you with a question, stop, slow down, answer the question, take a deep breath, or say, can we talk about that later tonight? If you're not ready to talk about it, give them a time to come back to it. Don't discourage questions. Oh, no, don't ask me that. Go ask your dad. I know I've done that, but I'm just saying, don't discourage the questions. They're inquisitive. They need to come to you with questions. I think Morgan said that. Don't embarrass them. Don't overreact, right? Like at 8 p.m. I tell my kids I become mama bear. And it sometimes is hard not to overreact because you're just overstimulated. So again, give them a time. Okay, yeah, we can talk about that. Let's do that once you go to bed, once mommy's had some time to brush her teeth or whatever. You can think about it. Don't just have the talk, right? This is an ongoing conversation. We talked about that in here. It's not a check off, like we're going to sit down, this is going to be our 15-minute conversation, and then that's all you're getting. This has to be ongoing. Make it a one-time discussion. Do not bring in too many personal details or stories. You touched on that. This is a private matter. This is something sacred. This is something, we keep behind closed doors. We keep it in the house. We don't air it out. Do not avoid eye contact, although there are times you definitely can, so that they can ask questions. Don't draw the conversation out to the point of awkward, and make them sit there and listen. I have an example of this, not related to the sex talk or anything, but my daughter Lily, this was a couple of years ago, so she would have been 5 or 6, sitting in the back of the car. She was asking about the Royer twins. Mom, what does it mean, fraternal and paternal twins? And I start going into egg and sperm, and they're coming together. And what does that mean? And one egg is fertilized. And she's sitting back there. Her eyes are getting bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden I'm realizing, what am I doing? I'm word vomiting, right? So you just need to rein it in. I can't always do that with my scientific words. Do not answer when you don't know the answer. So if you truly don't know the answer, say, I'll get back to you on that. That's a great question. Don't act like you know everything either, because that might make them feel intimidated to ask you the basic questions. Don't talk at them instead of listening. So just listen, take it all in, and don't jump to irrational conclusions either. Like, has something happened? Is everything okay? Again, those are the reactionary parts. Can anybody think of anything else? We talked before this, but anybody have anything to add to this? Some experience. Okay. So here are the takeaways. Keep calm. It's only puberty. This is part of God's plan. This is good. The term puberty encompasses changes that affect body, mind, and soul, all interconnected, right? While hormonal changes that drive puberty are well described, remember the mechanisms remain poorly understood. This is great. This is where our Christian worldview gets to step in and have an impact on them. The Tanner stages can be helpful for monitoring normal and abnormal physical changes. Puberty onset is dependent on a number of factors: genetics, body weight, race and ethnicity, overall health, social environment. As Christians, we have a good God with good answers for the social confusion, and you are the best person to talk to your kids about this scary and exciting time in their life. It should be you first. Well, thank you. I gave you some resources on the first page, the first soggy page.
It's dry now.
Yes, and then I didn't print enough for everybody to have both, because these are for older kids for talking about puberty. These are more for starting the conversation with younger kids. So this is an activity they can fill out on the image of God. And so if you want to grab those before you go, you're more than welcome to. And let me know if you have questions outside of this. You can email me, call me. I can send you the slideshow, whatever you want. I'm happy to answer more questions. Again, I'm not the ultimate authority on this or anything, but scientific questions I can certainly answer. I love to. So thank you for your attention.